Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. Part 4 of our deep dive into slavery in North America's indigenous people, Kevin Waite, assistant professor of history at Durham University in England, discusses his book, West of Slavery, The Southern Dream of the Transcontinental Empire. Professor Waite explains how railroads, camels, and the hope for new international markets all played a part in the coming of the Civil War, and then drove Confederate ambitions. We spoke on June 24th, 2022.
I'm Kevin Waite. I'm an assistant professor of American history at Durham University in the UK, and I wrote a book called West of Slavery.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And can you kind of give us an overview of what the book is about and why you tackled this subject?
Sure. So the book is basically a history of slaveholding expansion into the American West. And the argument is that slaveholding Southerners transformed a huge swath of the American map in the 1840s and the 1850s. So we're talking about California and New Mexico and Arizona, and to a certain extent, Utah, into basically a political client of the plantation states. And so enslaved African Americans were forcibly transported into, all parts of the American Southwest, into California, into New Mexico, into Arizona, into Utah. These places never developed what we could call sort of a plantation ecosystem. You couldn't find what looked like the cotton fields of Mississippi in 1850s California. But crucially, all of these states and territories, to a great extent, owed their political fealty to the slave South, and they voted with the slave South on the major political issues of the day. And I argue that this has enormous consequences for not only the coming of the Civil War, but how that war was fought and ultimately what emerged in the wake of the war, the political system and the labor order that emerged. And really the book is sort of pushing against two really important myths in American history. The first is that we can somehow quarantine the history of slavery and all the racial trauma that comes from it in the American South. And second, and relatedly, is this myth of the American West as a terrain of freedom, as a land made by these rugged white individualists that somehow remained isolated from all the ugliness of slavery and the political controversies that threw up.
Yeah, I think challenging those two myths you do very well in the book. And one of the things, as I was reading it, I said to my coworkers, do you know the history of the Transcontinental Railroad? And they all said, oh, let me guess, it has to do with slavery, because that's all I read about anymore. So could you maybe talk about how you spend a lot of time in the book kind of unpacking what the railroad meant in America, and especially to the South?
Sure. Yeah. So the book deals with what you could call the prehistory of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's not the Transcontinental Railroad that we think of. It's not the completed railroad that gets linked up in 1869. It really deals with the debates about where to run that road that just consumed congressional politics in the 1850s. And Americans could not agree on where this railroad should run. Northerners, politicians from free states, typically wanted the railroad to run across free soil and into the American West. Politicians from the slave South generally wanted it to run across slave country and into the American West. And they fought viciously over this issue because they knew whichever section of the country, North or South, got this railroad would collect the enormous profits that the railroad generated. And they would also probably, to a certain extent, control the political destiny of the American West. I mean, if this railroad was connected from the slave states to California, that would really bind together the southern half of the country, and it would pull California further into the political orbit of the slave South. Ultimately, this railroad is never constructed, and it's never constructed because Congress just couldn't agree on it. This was the major political issue or one of the major political issues almost every single year in the 1850s. Again and again, it came up for Congress, and again, it resulted in stalemate, largely because the conflict over slavery had become so intractable by the mid-1850s that neither side was willing to give any ground to the other on the issue of where this railroad should run. So, unbuilt railroads may not be the most sexy topics, but I argue that they really tell us a lot about how the country fought politically and why the country went to war when it did.
So maybe you could speak a little bit more about that too, because if one of the things I was interested to learn was that the South really saw China as its next marketplace, and having kind of saturated Europe. But so maybe you could talk a little bit more about how the railroad and this issue brought about the war.
Sure, and this part of the book, the early chapter, is about the railroad, and as John says, about the Southern interest in China. My interest in the subject was really born out of a great book called The Southern Dream of a Caribbean Empire by Robert May. And his book that I think was published in 1970 really touched off a number of important studies about slaveholding expansion and slaveholding expansion into the Atlantic basin. But I'm arguing in this book that Southerners thought almost as seriously about what their empire would look like across the Pacific world as well. And they were particularly interested in China because, Asia at this point in the early 1850s had about 600 million consumers. Slaveholding Southerners thought that it held 600 million consumers of Southern slave-grown cotton. And actually, they did succeed in making cotton the number one American export into China during this pre-Civil War period. It never became a huge part of the American export economy, but they were making inroads in the China market. And they thought that with the construction of a railroad from, say, Nashville into Southern California, that would funnel additional cotton across the southern belt of the country and then eventually across the Pacific. And so they're moderately successful in this aim. One of the reasons that America opens formal trade relations with China in the mid-1840s is to facilitate this cotton trade. And in the pursuit of this railroad, Southerners win some important political victories. So a lot of you may have read about the Gadsden Purchase of 1853 and 1854 in your, say, high school history textbooks. This is the sort of last major act of American territorial expansion prior to the Civil War. And the reason that the United States purchases this strip of mostly dusty territory from Mexico in the early 1850s is to make way for a transcontinental railroad along a far southern route. It was thought that the United States needed this strip of land, which is now southern New Mexico and southern Arizona. That was the flattest, best route for a deep south railroad.
Yeah, and the people, and we forget too that prior to the Civil War, the Southern agenda was very represented in the federal government. And I was interested to know kind of Jefferson Davis's history before the Civil War. And when you mentioned this strip of dusty land, he had a very original idea to bring camels over here. What was that? What was that about? That's a strange.
Yeah. This is one of the sort of wild, you could almost say quixotic episodes in the book, but I'm trying to argue that it has more political importance than we once thought. So Jefferson Davis will be a name familiar to a lot of you as the Confederate president, the one and only Confederate president. But really, his primary preoccupation before the Civil War was the westward expansion of slavery. And he backed a whole bunch of initiatives in order to facilitate the growth of slavery into the American West. I mean, he was really good buddies with a lot of politicians in California, and he kept a really close tab on political developments in the far West because he thought that this could become a really important ally for the slave South. And so one of these initiatives was to import camels into the United States West. he first brought up the issue in, I think it was 1853. He introduced the idea of an American Camel Corps in the U.S. Senate. And if you read the Senate transcription of that speech, it's got Jefferson Davis's attempts to convince Congress of this plan interspersed with, in brackets, laughter. He almost literally got laughed out of the Senate when he introduced this plan in 1853, but eventually he pushed hard enough for it that he was able to build this American Camel Corps. So over the course of the 1850s, the United States imported about 100 camels for use as military labor in the Southwest. And the argument, as Davis introduced it, was you equip American soldiers with camels who are better able to deal with the desert conditions of the American Southwest, to subdue the powerful Native American nations in this region and extend American control across the continent. And if you extend American control, really consolidate American power in this region, you also make it a lot easier for slaveholders to move into places like New Mexico and Arizona and maybe eventually California with their enslaved laborers. I mean, the Camel Corps is really a footnote in most American histories because, they did introduce 100 camels to the Southwest in the 1850s, but they weren't very popular with U.S. troops or travelers along the way. I mean, they were smelly, they shed, they spit on passersby. They were hard to deal with. It was much easier to use horses than camels. But there's an interesting afterlife to this camel experiment because Southern plantation owners in places like Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama caught wind of these camels, and they thought that they would be useful as labor on their plantations. And so roughly another 100 camels were imported into the American South to be used basically as mules were used to carry goods and to carry cotton across Southern plantations.
Yeah, it was an interesting little incident in the history in it, but I mean, it does make sense to a certain degree, I suppose. But I'd kind of like to now talk about the continental South and what they hoped, because as you said at the beginning, there were no plantations that spread west as we think of them in the South. So what actually happened and what was the South trying to accomplish in these states, basically California, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona?
Yeah, so the continental South is a concept I introduced at the beginning of the book, and it's basically a response to the way that I was taught American history, and so many of us were taught American history through our school textbooks. I mean, if you open virtually any American history textbook on the chapter on slavery and the coming of the Civil War, you'll see the American map divided into slave states and free states, and then Western territories. Slave states in one color, free states in another, and then usually the Western territories in some sort of neutral beige. But the argument of the book is that the American map, politically speaking, actually looks a good deal more like the map that appears on the cover of my book, that we should really think of the slave South as running across the length of the continent. It's basically the southern half of the United States, and we need to think seriously about the political orientation of New Mexico and Arizona and Utah and California, and consider these relatively southern places, because when these places voted on the major issues, they typically voted with the South. And I think it's helpful to scramble our sense of American political geography during this period because it gives us a bigger, broader understanding of the coming of the Civil War and who was involved. I mean, it's way too easy just to assume that the Civil War is this conflict between the free states of the Northeast and the slave states of the Southeast, but it was a continental political and ultimately military dilemma. And so by encouraging readers to think about the really continental dimensions of the slave South, I'm hoping to challenge them to see the entire Civil War in a new light.
And I think that's it kind of brings me to the next thing that I was interested to kind of find out about was that this breakaway from New Mexico and Arizona, and then just California as it kind of existed between the North and the South of the state, which is kind of a tension even today, but that it's helpful to think of it as if you cross the country, in half just what was happening politically in those territories at the time, right?
Sure. And I'll start with California. Maybe I'm starting with California because I'm Californian myself. And that was in a lot of ways the origin of my interest in this project. But, as a lot of you will know, California came into the Union as a free state formally in 1850 as part of the Compromise of 1850. And Southern slaveholders thought this was a catastrophic moment for them. They thought this pretty much spelled the end of the westward expansion of slavery. But pretty soon they found out that even though it was difficult but not impossible to import enslaved Black laborers into California, it was certainly possible to peel off the votes of California and the rest of the West. So actually what you get across the 1850s is California voting with the slave South, like I said, on so many major political issues because the major power brokers within the state, and in particular, one man named William Gwynn, who was a Mississippi planter come California senator. Gwynn continued to own and operate a massive plantation in Mississippi with about 200 enslaved Black laborers at the same time that he represented California in the Senate. And Gwynn used the patronage system really effectively to build this almost unbreakable political machine in California that owed its allegiance to him and owed its allegiance to slaveholders. So that in the mid-1850s, advocates of free labor were wondering, well, what can we do? What's gone wrong in this state? We thought this state was a free state. And there's a letter from a Boston abolitionist who moves to San Francisco in the mid-1850s, writing home to his wife, trying to wrestle with this question. And he says, what's the deal with these slaveholders running the show? He said, well, maybe it's because all of us enterprising Yankees went into business, and that left slaveholders with nothing else to do except go into politics and law. And to a certain extent, he's not wrong. Southerners in California were disproportionately represented in law and in politics, even though they represented at most about a third of the voting population. They were able to maintain this sort of stranglehold on politics in the state in that final decade until the Civil War. You have something similar going on in New Mexico. New Mexico, for most of this period, for most of the 1850s, was a massive territory that included what's now New Mexico and Arizona. During the secession crisis, the southern half of New Mexico actually broke off and formed a separate territory, the territory of Arizona. And Arizona declared its allegiance to the Confederacy. I mean, when we think about the Confederacy, we don't usually think of these Western territories, but in fact, the residents of Arizona seceded from the Union for much the same reason that 11 slaveholding states seceded from the Union. They wanted to protect slavery, and they thought slavery would be better served, the interests of Southern slaveholders would be better served out of the Union.
Well, and that's, and I think one of the explaining reasons, at least in your book, is this idea of the Native American slavery system, which was kind of debt-based. I'm not going to be able to pronounce it right. Peonage?
Got it. Yeah, peonage.
So maybe you could speak a little bit about that, and then also we'll get into kind of what happened with the Native Americans, especially the Apache and Navajo during the Civil War.
Sure. Great. Yeah, I'm glad you asked, John, because even if African-American chattel slavery didn't really take root in the American Southwest, one of the reasons it didn't is because people who wanted to own the labor of others had cheaper alternatives. And American slaveholders recognized this at the time. It was far easier to buy the labor of an indigenous person than it was to bring over an enslaved African American into a territory like New Mexico. So there were a number of ways to coerce Native Americans and to force them into usually lifelong labor relations without pay. You can argue about whether this constitutes slavery as we understand it. Often these Native Americans weren't held in hereditary captivity in the same way that African Americans were in the South, but the end result is really similar. The end result is a lifetime of servitude without pay. So there were a number of ways that an aspiring, call him slaveholder or master in the Southwest, could coerce the labor of Native Americans. One way to do it was to simply buy captive Native Americans who circulated across the sort of borderlands market economy. Often you would purchase a Native American child and use that child as a domestic laborer. There were also laws on the books in California and Utah that made it perfectly legal to adopt a Native American child as your ward, and then force that child into domestic servitude in your household until they reached usually the age of 18. Often the child would die before that. So effectively, this is lifelong slavery for them as well. And then, as you said, there's the institution of debt peonage, which is a really important part of the New Mexican economy in the pre-Civil War era. And how that worked basically was you trap peasants in cycles of lifelong debt. And in a lot of cases, that debt could, in fact, pass to one's offspring, making forced servitude hereditary, much like it was in the American South. So all you needed to do is find an indebted peasant, bind that peasant to your land, and then that peasant would owe you labor to work off the debt, which they could never really work off because you never paid them enough for the rest of their lives. And so the numbers on this are difficult to track down because people weren't, for obvious reasons, keeping really close records of all the Native Americans that they were enslaving. But tens of thousands of Native Americans were caught up in various forms of servitude before the Civil War.
Yeah, and as you said, that's part of the reason why chattel slavery didn't quite make it. I mean, aside from the terrain being not conducive, but the California definitely was. So why didn't slavery? Well, I guess it was a free state, right?
Yeah, and I mean, California for a while licenses slavery, and a lot of people do make good money off of the backs of enslaved African Americans, primarily in gold country. So at the outset of the gold rush, a number of Southerners brought African American slaves into California to help them mine for gold, or I should say to force them to mine for gold. Estimates vary, but historians, and Stacy Smith in particular is really excellent on this topic. Her book, Freedom's Frontier, she estimates that about 500 to 1,500 enslaved African Americans were smuggled into California, most of them around 1849 to the early 1850s. That may not sound like a huge number, but when you consider just how expensive each and every one of those African Americans were. I mean, the price of a field hand in the mid 1850s was about $1,000, which in today's currency is about $25,000. So to run the risk of bringing that piece of property, and this person was legally owned as property, to bring that person across the country, that's a pretty big financial risk. So you actually have to be pretty sure that you're going to get a good return on that investment. And I know that's a really crude term to use when we're talking about real live people, but slaveholders bringing African Americans west certainly thought of it as an investment, and a lot of them benefited from that investment that they made.
Let's talk about the Civil War now and these territories, especially what happened to them and what, during the war, and then we'll talk about it after.
So the continental South exists during the Civil War as well. And so to me, it's no coincidence that the very first Confederate invasion of the war wasn't into any of the free states of the North. It was into the far Southwest. It was into New Mexico and Arizona. And the goal of this Confederate invasion, it started really, really small, and it grew to an invasion force of about 3,000. The primary objective of this invasion force was to sort of cut a path towards California, and ultimately, hopefully, Confederate leaders thought, secure the gold shipments of California. But this Confederate invasion also tried to shore up the defenses in Confederate Arizona. Remember, this territory had seceded from the Union in much the same way that, say, Texas or Louisiana seceded from the Union. And Confederates, at least initially, were fairly successful with this invasion. A Confederate army, the Confederate Army of New Mexico, actually captured Santa Fe, which made it the only Confederate army to ever capture a capital in Union territory. Ultimately, this Confederate invasion force was beat back by a far superior Union force, and they had to cut a really sort of hasty and madcap retreat back to Texas. And so some historians look at this in sort of the same way that they look at Jefferson Davis's Camel Corps as something of an errand into the wilderness. I mean, this Confederate invasion eventually came to naught. And I guess militarily, sure, it was ultimately unsuccessful. But if you consider it really a continuation of the politics of the pre-Civil War period, if you consider it a continuation of this slaveholding effort to seize control of the American West, it actually links up quite nicely. And so it shouldn't be any surprise to those of us who are interested in this history that Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders were keenly interested in New Mexico and California because they saw that region as, in some ways, part of the slave South already.
Well, and it also brings us to the kind of the Confederate imperial ambitions. And, you mentioned how it's rewritten after the war, but what were the Confederate imperial ambitions? I mean, it's written into their Constitution, correct?
Exactly. So Jefferson Davis goes on record a number of times during and after the war to say, we have no imperial ambitions. All we want is to be left alone. Just let us go in peace. And Robert E. Lee repeats this line after the war too. And so they repeat it enough that it's sort of entrenched in Confederate lore that no, this was really a defensive action, and that the slave states of the South just wanted to go in peace. Well, all you have to do is look at what they were doing in the American West, and you'll realize pretty quickly that they didn't have any intention of remaining a sort of non-expansionist and peaceful polity. It's true that for a lot of the 1850s, slaveholding Southerners had a real interest in carving up pieces of the Caribbean and making places like Cuba into the next slave state. And during the Civil War, Confederate leaders actually sort of abandoned their plans for expansion into the Atlantic Basin. And they abandoned these plans primarily because they're worried about what sort of signal that will send to Europe. I mean, if Confederates launched an invasion of Cuba during the Civil War, that would not have been good for their foreign policy. But they could launch an invasion of New Mexico, and they hoped of California, without incurring the same sort of foreign policy costs. And so, like you say, John, the right to expand was written explicitly into the Confederate Constitution. There's a clause in the Constitution that reads that the Confederacy can incorporate additional territories, and those additional territories must legalize the institution of slavery. So it doesn't get a whole lot clearer than that. The Confederates were out for an empire. They just didn't succeed in building one.
Right, and they, ultimately lost the war too. But and I think now we can talk a little bit about the monuments that were created in California, especially after the war and post-war years. But let's talk about that, because it seems like the lost cause narrative really has dominated our understanding of the post-war and what led up to it. Why do you think that is, and why is it successful?
Yeah, so the lost cause makes its way into the American West in really the early 20th century. And that's the really long tail to my book. So the book ends in basically modern day California, looking at the Confederate statues that were built across the 20th century. And from a certain perspective, it's absolutely wild. Why would you build a Confederate monument in California, in this free state? But again, with the power of hindsight and what we know about how slavery and slaveholders operated in California and the far west, it actually makes some sense why we could find these Confederate monuments there. So California in the 20th century contained far more Confederate monuments and place names and markers than any other free state in the country. I've found more than a dozen of them in total. So there were markers to the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway. There was the town of Confederate Corners. There were 3 monuments or memorials, I should say, to Confederate soldiers in Orange County, in San Diego, in Hollywood. There is this really scenic series of foothills at the base of the Sierra Nevadas, known as the Alabama Hills, named for the CSS Alabama, the feared Confederate warship. There were trees, redwood trees, named for Robert E. Lee, a mountain named for Jefferson Davis, and 2 schools named for Robert E. Lee. So the lost cause was in California. Confederate heritage was in California. I mean, most people didn't really know much about these monuments. They were hiding in plain sight for almost a century. And it was really only with first the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, and then the murder of George Floyd, that brought scrutiny to these monuments. Today, if you go looking for a Confederate monument or memorial or place name in California, you're probably not going to find any. Basically, all of them have been removed or renamed, except for the trees named for Robert E. Lee, because those trees must be renamed through a congressional act. They're still technically named for Robert E. Lee, although all the signage is removed. So good luck finding a Confederate monument in California today, but they were there, and they were there for the better part of a century.
And they were there because the California has a rich and long legacy of racism even after the war, because when the war ends, then the anti-Chinese movement comes in and some of that. And you also mentioned this group of Confederates that moved to LA, which I think was just a weird thing that had happened.
Yeah. So after the war, like I said, there were a number of white Southerners in California prior to the war, and there were a number of Confederate sympathizers in California during the war. I mean, Los Angeles may have been majority Confederate. California as a whole remains loyal to the Union, but in Southern California, it's really touch and go. So actually, to refer to an earlier question you asked, John, about sort of the division within California, there is a division within California for a lot of the 1850s and through the Civil War that sort of mirrors the division in the country at large. I mean, the northern part of California is more populous. It's more affluent in the 1850s and more anti-slavery. The southern part of California is more rural and more pro-slavery. And Los Angeles, the frontier town of LA, was really the heart and soul of pro-slavery California. So after the war, a number of Confederate veterans moved to Los Angeles County. They moved there because some of their friends are there already. And they moved there, for the same reason so many people have moved to California over the years. It's climate. And they opened the only Confederate veterans retirement home outside of the former slaveholding states and territories. It's in San Gabriel. It's in this leafy suburb of Los Angeles. And dozens of Confederate veterans passed through this rest home in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and most of them are buried in Hollywood Cemetery, what's now Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and they're buried in a special Confederate plot in Hollywood Cemetery, and their friends erect a memorial to commemorate their service to the Confederacy, right in the middle of Hollywood, right in the middle of Los Angeles. I came across this memorial over the course of my research, and not much had been written on it. It was just this weird curiosity. But there are a ton of memorials in Hollywood Forever Cemetery, so this one didn't get any attention. But then I wrote an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times in 2016, and I think about a couple of days after the op-ed appeared, the white supremacist riot and rally in Charlottesville broke out. That generated real interest in Confederate monuments across the country. And actually, this one in Hollywood was removed. But it was built in 1925 or erected in 1925, which makes it the earliest, to my knowledge, the earliest Confederate monument anywhere on the Pacific coast.
Wow, that's amazing. And of course, the plot is still there. Just the memorial was gone.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's crazy to think about why those memorials went up at the time they did, and the super problematic history that we just ignore or don't know about.
Yeah. And those memorials in California go up for much the same reason that memorials in the South go up. At least one of the Robert E. Lee schools was named for him right in the wake of Brown v. Board. It was basically a protest against school desegregation. Often these memorials, as I'm sure your viewers know, go up as a way of pushing back against the slow incremental gains that African Americans had been making towards civil rights.
That's right, and the Daughters of the Confederacy, which we'll discuss today. But is there anything, if you could have like your elevator pitch about the book, what would we walk away with having learned from it?
That slavery wasn't a regional institution. It wasn't ever something that you could keep in the 15 slave states of the South. That leaked out across the continent, and it took lots of different shapes and forms. So I think we need to think of American slavery in a more kaleidoscopic way. It was primarily African Americans, 4 million of them, who were forced into slavery by the eve of the Civil War. But that also includes tens of thousands of Native Americans trapped in all sorts of states of bondage. American slavery really was a transcontinental institution, and it was a multi-ethnic institution.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Waite's Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit waiteslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.